I think we've got enough people here so we can get started. Sue, are you there? Can you hear me?
I can perfectly. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, welcome back to Duke virtually again. Welcome to you all who have joined us. And of course, I should welcome myself back because this is my first big well, I guess I did one other event this summer with General Dempsey, but this feels like the beginning of the new year. And it's appropriate that we have with us Director Sue Gordon, because I believe, Sue, you were our first or one of our earliest guests when we made the big jump to the Zoom era in spring of 2020.
I think I was.
And I think you are going to be our last guest in the Zoom era. We're hoping that our next event will be in person if all goes well. And I think that the T-shirt that we sent you was sent by the container ship Ever Green, right? I think it took this long to get you. So that's from 16 months ago. Never let it be said that we won't pay our debts, but we might take our time in paying them. But of course, everyone should know Sue Gordon. She's had a long, distinguished professional career. Rose to be Deputy Director of National Intelligence. She's one of the leading thinkers at the interface of intelligence, cyber and new technology, national security. She's a national resource. She's also happily a Duke resource. She is a Rubenstein Fellow and has been with us now since she retired from a government service. And so, Sue, thank you so much for being here.
No, I'm delighted to be here. Love to be associated with Duke. Can't wait to do a actual event with you in the coming year. And I'd do anything for you, Peter. You're just that good.
Well, the American Grand Strategy Program, our mission is to raise the next generation of strategists by studying past generations and interacting with the current generation. And we do this through a variety of ways. We're going to have a salon on August 11th with Professor Miles discussing a book, A Spy Among Friends. It's supposed to be a sort of fun summer reading, a chance to discuss it with some friends and with Professor Miles. I encourage you to sign up for that. And then we'll be back in person doing our meeting and greeting on Monday, August 23rd at 6 p.m. for our ice cream social, which is our traditional launch. That's in the Gross Hall atrium area. And that'll be the start of the year. But right now, we want to take advantage of our connection with Sue, and I want to begin with where the real action is, and that is over in Japan in the Olympics. So what can you tell us as former captain of the Duke women's basketball team? What can you tell us about the great glory that Duke's own Coach Lawson brought back just recently?
Yeah, I love that the Kara era begins with her continuing the gold medal run of Duke coaches as Olympic coaches. I'm not totally sold on 3-on-3 as an Olympic sport, watching people play pickup basketball, half-court basketball. But good for Kara, good for Duke. And I'm really excited about Kara starting her tenure with Duke. She is certainly a remarkable basketball talent and coach, but even a better person, high integrity, exactly what we're looking for. So yay us. Duke has so many athletes over there. It's just really, I don't know. It's hard for me to decide in which I have more pride, America, that I just love, or Duke, which I also love.
Well, now you said you're not a fan of 3-on-3. If they had it back in your day, would that have been a sport you would have excelled in? Did your game lend itself to 3-on-3 or?
Well, so you just reminded me of my first meeting with President Trump and former President Trump. And this is when I was being considered for nomination to my position. And I get called in, and I'm not really sure Is it an interview? Do I have the job? Can I lose the job? And I don't care who you are. I don't care who the president is. I don't care how many times you've been in there. You walk into the Oval Office, there's a certain amount of trepidation. So I walk in and I get introduced, and the head of presidential personnel says something, and Dan Coates says, yeah, she's a pretty good intelligence officer, but she was 3-time captain of the Duke women's basketball team. And the president says, well, you are tall. And I said, Mr. President, I'm 1976 tall. I'm not 2017 tall. So my answer, would that have been a sport I excelled at? I don't think I will ever say that I excelled at basketball. I was a decent ball player and I could lead. And I knew how to use my teammates. So.
Very good. And do you have any forecast for the men's team? I was teasing General Dempsey, who of course is the chairman of USA Basketball, that this is a tough year for him to be chairman on the men's side. But yeah.
I don't know. They seem to have awakened versus Iran, although yes. That's not quite the same as Spain or Australia or France or others. I don't know. I think it's a tough year for the men. I think just the way the NBA season played out, it almost like it never ended, and then the guys just come over. And basketball is almost like technology, which I say is ubiquitous. Every technology is available to everyone. Well, everyone plays basketball well now. It's not just that the US has that much of an advantage.
Well, let me ask you to take your sporting cap off and put your intel cap off. And one more question about the Olympics. Is it an intelligence bonanza? I mean, is this a chance, or is this a time when countries sort of temporarily put their spycraft behind them and they just, honor the sport? But from an intelligence and counterintelligence point of view, is there something to be thinking about or looking for in the Olympics? Yeah,
no, it's always an intelligence bonanza, right? So intelligence officers and everyone's service. Intelligence is about knowing a little bit more, a little bit sooner. There is nothing better than talking to humans because they carry that magical thing called intent. Anytime the Olympics are held, it's a little bit like Vienna in the 1960s. It's just a very target-rich environment. I do think that one of the interesting things about today's environment is no one is really sure where the line in the sand or the red line is. And so I think the Olympics themselves as a target, people would be loath to use that as an actual target of action, but a target of opportunity to learn about what's going on in nation states, given that everyone is there. Absolutely.
Of course, in 1972, we did have the terrorist attack on that, but I'm thinking at the level of great power politics, which is what I was mostly wondering about. There's obviously competition at the prestige level.
Yes.
The China wants to be at the top of the leaderboard. US wants to be at the top of the leaderboard. But you're telling me that there's also competition at the can we cultivate people level, the human side of things.
Yeah. So intelligence isn't just information absent context, right? It just isn't, especially in the modern world where the fact of things is a commodity. So what is so great about the environment and still using people and seeing who's talking to whom and having meetings with people on the edges of the great power competition is you have the opportunity to get information in context. And so I think we could talk about, and I always do, about how this is a world where all the threats and opportunities go through information, and we have to use information technologies much better than we have in the past. But there is still something remarkable about how humans process information, and so they become just as interesting a target today as before.
Well, let me bring in the technology piece. And would you recommend that all the US athletes throw out their iPhones after they've been in the Olympics and start over with a fresh one that maybe wasn't compromised? Is it with the cyber, what I'm getting at is with the cyber dimension, does that introduce just whole new vulnerabilities for the team and for us as a country, even in the Olympics and beyond, of course?
Well, for sure. I don't know if I would say it to every athlete, because I'm not sure that that's going to work anyway, but I would say all your electronic media will be compromised.
Wow. Well, let me press you.
It just will be, whether it is for future opportunity, whether it's for the data that exists, or whether it is just getting data that can be used into this great morass that can be practiced on. So that is true. You know, I would tell anyone who has position to say, in addition to understanding that your electronic media will be compromised, I will also say there is no protection that is enough to protect important conversations. So just don't have them.
Yeah.
Just don't have
Well, let me ask you then an equally impossible question. In the news in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the revelations of the Pegasus project and the targeting of individual leaders via their iPhones, I guess, primarily.
Yeah.
We also saw the ransomware,
Yes.
which took down critical infrastructure, at least temporarily. And we saw reports of supply chain malware traced back, according to press reports, to great powers,
right,
adversaries. So which of those three is the most alarming, and how would you rack and stack across those three horribles?
So each of the three represent a really significant trend that is problematic. So first, let me start with just naming what I think they represent. Pegasus represents the kind of capability that had been the purview of nation states for some sort of controlled activity, whether it's controlled by law, the United States, whether it's controlled by finding, whether it's controlled by not wanting people to inadvertently create a crisis. Pegasus is now saying, no, that technology is out there being used privately, both for sale and for private purposes. So that is a really interesting trend that is problematic. Hold on, I have a little bit of noise in the background, just one sec. The colonial pipeline is what we have all been afraid of, and that is cyber actions that turn into physical effects. So even in this case, they didn't really get into the pipeline system, and the pipeline was shut off by the company itself because they were afraid that it would be controlled. That is a really problematic thing. Cyber effects that become physical, like the Russians turning off power in Ukraine. That is what we're afraid of. And ransomware is a really one. It is costing us trillions of dollars. It is an epidemic, and though it may not be conducted by nation states, it is conducted by people in nation states that could not exist if it weren't harbored by that. So they're each really different, and they're each problematic. What do I think is the worst?
Well, the third one, you didn't mention the supply chain penetration.
Right. Oh, and the supply chain penetration. As a collective, I think what they tell you is, I think that people have been thinking that cyber is something weird and special and only happens to a few people. I will tell you, if you think you won't be affected by it, you're not thinking square. And so all these things we've talked about security have got to come in from the citizen to the company, big to small. I think the worst trend is that we have nation states attacking private companies. Right. And it isn't a fair fight. And even though I think this administration, continuing on the work that started in the previous administration, is trying to get this public-private partnership going to defend, I think we're still talking about it as if the users would just use a longer password and not click on any links, we're going to be okay. No, that cannot be our solution. So we are facing a set of attacks that represent not only physical effect, but an effect makes us wonder whether anything can be true anymore.
Wow.
It has to be countered. It cannot just be countered by password security or cyber hygiene. All those things are good. This administration now owns this and has got to get off the dime on it.
So this is reminding me of conversations that took place during in the wake of the revelations from Assange and Snowden, et cetera. How is what's being done to us different from what we have been doing to others for a long time? And is it just the fact that everyone else is caught up with us, like they have in USA basketball, I mean, in Olympic basketball, and we don't like it? But we used to dunk on them, and now they're dunking on us occasionally.
So Paul Colby of up at the Belfer Center at Harvard wrote a really interesting op-ed after the SolarWinds attack that basically told everyone to settle down. That was really just an intelligence collection activity. And we've all been collecting intelligence on each other for a long time in various means. You know, probably we don't need to go to general quarters over that. Where I would say the difference is between what has always been done is, one, again, we're starting to see real physical effect, costing trillions of dollars to companies, putting companies out of business, affecting supply chain. That is in the civilian economy, that is certainly for the United States, is a very different set of things. We just don't do it. Similarly, we don't do theft of intellectual property of foreign private companies to advance our own national. You just don't do that. So there are some things we just don't. We're a nation.
The United States does not do that.
We're a nation.
But some of our allies and partners do.
They are, but I'm saying that I think the biggest difference that I see between, the old spy versus spy thing, what are you complaining about? This is just that game now digitally affected. I think when you see nation states attacking private entities, when you see physical effect, you're starting to see something that is raising to a different level. Also, the spillover to civilian casualties, how is massive. And this ransomware thing, which right now is about money, you can imagine that technique employed by a nation state in a time of a pandemic that shuts down medical centers and keeps them from being able to do things. So even the most benign in terms of national security, that technique employed at a time that's critical against parts of our economy that support national security, I think are problematic. And while not different in the capability we have, very different target set, very different extent, and very different foundation legally.
So is there a blame story in here? If you and I were meeting 20 years ago, we would have said US is at the cutting edge and clearly at the leader in almost every one of the technologies we've been talking about. And we're not anymore. Is that because of mistakes that were made by the US government or by US private companies or some other thing? Can we blame someone, or is this just natural evolution of competition and geopolitical? That we had an artificial advantage that we should not have thought we could sustain.
So I think it's a little bit of all of those, right? I think certainly it is a natural evolution of what happens in a digitally connected world, right? What really happens in a digital connected world is everything becomes a commodity because it all moves so fast and partners are different and you can't hold anything anymore. And so what one knows, everyone knows. What everyone knows, everyone can advance. And so you just see this blooming of technology and uses and interconnectedness that has been going on for a long time. I think the pandemic actually put it in physical relief about how different and how connected the world is. So a little bit about what's going on in cyber is just this effect of a connected world where everyone can use anything that is found, and then it can be grown because you now have worldwide expertise to help you, not just the 5 experts that are in your country. So that's one. 2, in that world, countries with an installed base are at a disadvantage right? Because in a world where technology is a commodity that everyone has it, it's not the technology itself, but it's the one that can put it to use faster is the one that will win. And typically the one who is putting it to use in a greenfield is going to be faster than someone who's trudging along with the Cold War behind them. And then the third thing is this pesky nation of laws thing. You know, the fact that we do actually constrain ourselves, that I think is problem. And probably then the fourth thing in terms of blame is, I do think as a collective, the intelligence community, and I'm always going to be more critical of the intelligence community because it's mine. I will say, just as a disclaimer, I think our intelligence community is, one, the best in the world, two, is better today than it's ever been. I'm still going to say that two things probably we were slow on. Number one, that things happening in cyber, in the digital environment, I think everyone's thinking that that was just happening in cyber and it wasn't a real thing. And we kind of missed the fact that cyber effects land somewhere physically. They do, whether the origin is physical or the effect is physical. And so probably a little slow to understand what that game really was. And then the second thing is understanding that cyber has now become the modality for every nation state and every entity to affect its interests. And I think because it is a technical discipline, we kept it with our technologists rather than saying, no, all our geopolitical analysts have to understand these technical things because it's affecting perception and influence and elections and truth and all those things. So I think we were a little slow to realize that this technical discipline was having real geopolitical effect that had nothing to do with the technology.
So, well, you've dangled at least three threads that I want to pull on. So let me pull on one. The one that you just barely mentioned, I expected you to go deeper, was that in the heyday, it was the U.S. government cooperating with AT&T, Bell Labs, very cozy relationships. And in the last 15 years or so, it's been companies in Silicon Valley who seem to have a more hands-off or arm's length relationship, Facebook, what have you, not quite as cozy a relationship with the intelligence community, let's put it that way. So is that a fair characterization, or am I overstating it?
Oh, yes, it's a fair characterization. No, I don't think you're overstating it. So I think there were two seminal events in cyber, in technical collection, that affected what we have going on now. One was Stuxnet. So that's 2010. Some nation state, a nation state's activity against Iran's nuclear capability lost containment.
Right.
And the tool got out in the wild, which wasn't a big thing. That happens all the time. The problem was when the tool got out in the wild in this connected world, everyone could see that it was a weird tool, and that made it interesting. And that took it from the pages of the antivirus community to the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And so now you have everyone now going, Glorioski, this stuff is going on, and this stuff is big and useful, and now we're paying attention. So that's one. And so you see the rise of the antivirus community, you see the rise of the FireEyes and the Mandiants and Symantec that are all now big players about exposing what's going on in the digital world because of that. So that's one.
Right.
And then the second is Snowden.
Right.
And what he exposes is some pieces of that partnership and between the government and companies. And we could go into that as a whole topic, but the effect of his disclosures on our private sector, who, whether they had ever been involved with us or not, whether they had ever done anything wrong, now all their adversaries and competitors could say, prove to us that you're not doing it.
Right.
And the burden on them. And so then they become reticent because now it affects their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And so I think those two things certainly play into this world and made it transparent. And now what we're dealing with is, how do you put that genie back in the bottle? And so you mentioned Pegasus early on. I think you could probably trace back some of the parentage of Pegasus to some of those exposures that showed the potential. And now we have people affecting it that aren't constrained. Really interesting.
Well, that was my second thread I want to pick up, because you said it almost as an, oh, by the way, we obey the law, which I suspect at least some people on our meeting today will say, what? I thought Intel was all about breaking the law. And I read a story that the FISA process was poorly done for, this Russian investigation, and et cetera, et cetera. In other words, what you said as obvious might not be obvious to lots of our listeners. So can you persuade us about that point?
The intelligence community, despite having some special authorities, is absolutely 100% beholden to the Constitution of the United States. Period. Swear to uphold, when I was a member of it for 40-some years, I swore to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's not a bad place to start. Whether mistakes are made, that's a different issue. Whether things are implemented in a way that imagine how they could be used, that's a different issue. Those are the moments where you see reviews and you have it checked and you come back around. But I would say there's just nothing cavalier and casual. Mm-hmm. Right? There's oversight and beyond. Here's where I think.
And when you say laws, you're referring to U.S. laws, right?
U.S.
We're not respecting Russian laws, or Chinese laws necessarily.
No, but
what about international?
I think what has happened, so again, Snowden, a lot of things happened post Snowden in terms of policy that made it very clear what the standard was for who you could do collection on and how you can do that. National leaders, you see this over time. The intelligence community doesn't participate in assassinations. That is a historic growth from early authorities that didn't prescribe that in the same way. So every time things get exposed and things happen and you see the effect of them, you move on. But is there an expectation and intention to follow the law and the Constitution and to do things, whether they are with a presidential finding that allows something to happen covertly, or whether it is just the normal construct of business? I think I can tell you that in the normal course of business, that governs the activities of the intelligence community, just as it governs the activities of the Department of Defense and the Department of State. I will tell you, the other thing I will say, that in this world, those constraints that I believe in, by the way, are being exploited by our adversaries left and right.
They know U.S. law. They've gone to school.
They know U.S. law. One of the most interesting trends has been the movement of our adversaries to activities within the United States, because they understand that the intelligence community can't follow them there. Mm-hmm. Which is why it was so important that the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI became part of the intelligence community, so you didn't lose lock. Right. Equifax, so you all can all buy pairs of shoes online, has access to more of U.S. persons' information than the intelligence community does. So now we're running up to this moment of all those things that we believe in are actually being used by our adversaries. And so now we're being under cyber attack. And there's this real question of who's going to come tromping in with big Tyrannosaurus Rex feet to save the day? Is it the intelligence community that's going to go into private companies and solve the cyber problem? So I think there's some real issues there, but I can assure you that there are pretty solid constraints on us. And when our intention exceeds our authority, usually, in my experience, that's when you see the Congress and our oversight pull us back in and say, yeah, good try, no.
So the other thread that you dangled was the the geek versus policy, two cones. There'd be a room where the geeks are doing the geek technology. They understand technology, can't speak policy. And in the other room, there's the policymakers who are making policy, don't understand technology. And that's an age-old problem in the United States, but it's one that every administration, I think at least beginning with the Clinton administration, identified as this is a problem we need to fix. It's still a problem. So why haven't administrations fixed it? And two, the current administration, which has made a really big deal about this, do you think that they are finally in a position to, bridge across those silos of excellence, as they say?
Yeah, I'll get to that. And if I don't get to that, bring me back to it. Let me try and, for our audience, give my best example of the problem. So every intelligence officer that I know understood that the Soviet Union's doctrine was to undermine democracy, particularly that practiced by the United States. This is a doctrinal approach. It was active measures, in the Cold War. So we know that, and Russia also has that doctrine. That is there to undermine democracy. How in the world then were we surprised in 2016 with their assault on the election? Right? Now, the technologists certainly knew that all these things were possible. How did it not go to the analysts of what was going on in Russia to say, they've got some of the best capability in a technology that allow them to do what they've always done, but at a speed, volume, and stealthiness that we haven't ever seen? How did we not know? So I think if you look at the surprise about the action on the election, it's a great instantiation of that. No, we had all the technical people doing cyber. We know about Russia's cyber capability, and we had all the things, but we didn't bring it together. Okay, so that's just.
Wait, let me interrupt you there, because I'm going to defend Obama for a second. Okay, because the Obama team, which by the way is mostly the Biden team, moved it up one level. So if Jake Sullivan were here, he might say, well, we knew about it, but how could we do anything about it when it was our administration candidate, Secretary Clinton, running? And so if we did anything, it would be transparently seen as partisan, trying to help our person against their person. So it was not a lack of, not a surprise, but it was kind of I don't know what we can do, a sort of a deer in the headlights. How do we do this without making the situation worse?
Maybe, I don't know. I think if you thought that the election was a real threat surface, I don't think you could have allowed our state and local governments to be as unprepared as they were technically. Now, what we know now is that influence became the big thing, and that's problematic, but there was also interference attempts. Right. So did we see that?
Minor, the influence.
Yeah, but did we see that action going on?
Yeah.
Under the Obama administration? So I would say, I'd put it in the same category of, we knew that Al-Qaeda wanted to do something big against the United States, but because the intelligence community couldn't say what it was going to be, somehow we just kept telling people something bad was going to happen. And I think even in that case, if you thought about it, you could have said, all right, how are we going to get more information about what's going on? I mean, right. Because in order for it to be actionable, we're going to have to get more information. And you don't see that really going on with the energy that I think you could expect. So I don't know that I blame anybody, but I do think there is this lack of crossover between the technical disciplines and cyber. Again, it started out by us thinking what was going on in the digital environment was somehow not physical, and we had to learn that lesson.
Right.
And now it's that it's just the modality that people express their interest. It is different, but it's not special.
So where I would, having defended them, where I would criticize them is, how can it be the case that in 2022, well, 2021, but looking ahead to the 2022 elections, President Biden has said they're already doing it to us again, so it's, if you give them a pass in 2016, you
can't give them
a
a
pass in 2022.
I
So talk
really,
now about the current team and how well they're doing on this particular issue, but the more general issue as well of technology and.
yeah, so I actually love this administration's intention. The executive orders they've put out, they're trying to really connect with the private sector, come up with ways. I love the legislation that just came out, directing companies to have to share information. I love the strength that they're trying to give to CISA, to, what Chris Krebs started. I think they're trying to buttress it. I love Chris Inglis having that responsibility. They've got a person in the NSC now. So I think there are a lot of good things going on. And what are we going to do? And so I would say that we still have a dearth of leaders who understand technology. And so technical solutions still look more risky or less certain than the solutions we have right now. So it's, how do I trust that? How do I know? And so what I would say is one of the things that's going to happen nationally is more leaders are going to have technical conversance, mostly so they can implement solutions that right now seem, oh, I don't know how I understand that or trust that or any version of that sort of thing. But this administration is going to either advance the cause, or President Biden's comment about cyber will be the precursor for a shooting war. I mean, it's now getting almost epidemic about how compromised our systems are by foreign adversaries.
So I want to now take you geographically around to some hotspots. And I want to remind our audience that you should, if you would like to ask questions, you can send a private chat to Paige Rotunda, who is, I should have welcomed her at the outset. She is the incoming program coordinator of AGS, and we love to have her on board, and she will field your questions and make sure I get to them. So please do that, or you can raise your hand on the Zoom function, and she'll note that and tell me to call on you if you would like to pose the question directly yourself. In that case, we'll ask you to turn on your mic and your video. But Sue, let me take you now across the globe. As you know, for much of your professional career, the intelligence community was focused like a laser on the CENTCOM theater, Middle East. Still a lot of bad things could emanate from that place, so I don't think you can ignore it. But it seems like all of the career incentives are to look elsewhere, not in Middle East, but East Asia or Eastern Europe, Russia's near abroad, et cetera. So if you were advising future intelligence community specialists, would you tell them to specialize in regions? And if so, what's the region that you think is and the language relatedly, that is the most important and where you stay worried and focused on regionally?
What a great question. So when I think it comes down to deciding what to do about a circumstance that presents itself, if you don't have people with in-depth knowledge of cultures and regions, you are going to be stuck, right? If capability is one thing, but use is another. That use requires understanding my earlier comment about context. So I think regional expertise is really, really important. I would say that I think the drivers today are far more economic than they are political and military. And those economic drivers force a kind of situational ethic or situational partnership that is very different from what I grew up with. Is, I always used to say the strength of the United States is that we had friends and other people didn't. But in an economically driven world, in a connected world, in a world of availability and abundance, those partnerships are as much driven by economic need as it is by security protection. And so regional expertise, understanding of economic drivers, understanding of technology and more information technologies, because those are the ones that today are giving advantage of speed and reach, even more so than the physical weaponry goes on, are the areas where I would encourage people to drive. And just take a look at China, that everyone, if someone says, gives any answer to what is the most concerning nation state right now, and if they don't say China, they won't be in a job very much longer, because that's what we all say right now. And there are lots of good reasons for saying that. But if we look at the threat China poses as though it is the new Soviet Union threat, we will miss the nature of the threat they pose. They are much more expansionist. They are putting much more money out there. They have a much different approach in terms of how they get advantage, much longer time frame. And so you have to take all the things I said earlier and then apply them to each of these nation states to really understand what is problematic about them, what their techniques, and then ultimately what the deterrence is going to be. So go ahead.
Let me push you on that to see, sticking with China, did I hear you say that we should be paying more attention to, say, China's activities in Belt and Road, or efforts at economic and political influence in our hemisphere? And we're maybe not focusing, we as public are not focusing as much on that as we should. And we might be over dramatizing things like the revelation of the new ICBM launchers, which is old school nuclear arms of the old sort, but maybe not where the competition, what I thought I heard you say, the competition is more focused in the economic, geoeconomic arena. It's probably at both ends. So
it's both ends, right? And so I was going to at some point mention, I will always worry about nuclear capabilities and nuclear proliferation. I will worry about the fact that both Iran and North Korea had the ability to become nuclear states if they aren't already, and what that means in terms of security, because it is very different from the P5+1 and if they become nuclear states in terms of what they would make available and things that happen. So we can never forget about that, and weapon systems as well. But if you think about the precursors to that, right, where the stressors are, where the alliances are formed, when you are establishing strength and partnerships, let me give an example. Who would have thought that we would have had, at least temporarily, a hard time with the UK following our lead about not going with Huawei for 5G? Right. That's anathema, right? In the past, you can't. And especially once we told you don't, it would be like, yeah, okay, good. But their economic drivers were such that it was a really tough call, especially as they're withdrawing from the European Union at the same time. China is a massive investor. We know that China is punitive to those who cross them. And the whole 5G thing is difficult anyway. So I think that's more what I mean, that is, you're building coalitions, building partnerships. It is complicated by what China is doing economically in regions that are not front burner, but they are important when and if you have to put a coalition together in order to conduct some action. Just look at the Iran, right? We pulled out of JCPOA. Who's mad at us? Europe.
Europe, right.
Right. So
And
that's just an interesting, I just think, and one of the reasons they're mad is the economic impact of what happens to them when Iran decides that it's going to not develop nuclear weapons that could more threaten Europe than us, but actually what they do economically to Europe when that happens. So I think that's all I'm saying. The weapon side is there, and we know those, that is always problematic. Some of the new weapons are actually very difficult for our defenses to work against, and we have to be really aggressive. Space is another area where I think Russia, China particularly, which 5 years ago was nothing in space, they are now really launching. I think last year they launched more spacecraft than anyone else did. So all those things are going on. But this economic thing is a really interesting one about how you form alliances and partnerships.
the insult added to the injury for UK is, and I realize it's a different administration, but a year or so later, we cut Germany slack on Nord Stream 2.
I know.
And so the UK says, what? We take this hit, and then
Yeah,
Germany gets
Peter, I think that's a
all
really interesting point. Is back to my point about the advantage of the United States is we had friends. I think one of the things this administration is focusing really hard on is how to reestablish confidence in our partners.
Mhm.
Right. And they're not totally sold yet. They're a little bit wait and see. Is it talk? Is it real? And I think that's another area where are we going to get the money to put into the investments? Listen, the Chinese investing $1 billion deep water port in Djibouti is $1 billion into a deep water port in Djibouti that we didn't offer them. So
Right.
I think it's maybe I overstated it, but I think it's certainly a factor that we have to consider.
Okay, I have got a ton of questions I want to ask you, but this is a question that came from Grace Garverick on.
Hi, Grace.
Who's on the thing, and she asks, given that so many large private companies and CEOs make decisions every day that potentially affect national security, do you think that the intelligence community should include them as one of their customers of intelligence? That's an interesting question.
Well, Grace, one, just hearing your name makes me happy. I hope everything's well. Loved our time together this past year. I think I am on the record, and I will restate it here, that the threat surface worldwide now extends beyond governments, and the national security decision makers and the global security decision makers are also outside government. You cannot argue the decisions made by Google, Facebook, AT&T are affecting national security. So to me, it does require consideration of if they are the both being threatened and they are the actors, decision makers, don't we want them to have good information upon which to make better decisions and better protect themselves? Given the government, just given the way our nation is set up, we believe in this, the government isn't going to go trooping into companies and just doing things to them, right? So I think, one, that's a wise decision. Two, I think it requires the development of some tradecraft to do that well, because anyone who's ever been on the other side of an unclassified intelligence community briefing, you're like, that's worse than the newspaper, because it's just hard for us to figure out how to do it. So I think we have to be willing to give up more of our special stuff. And I think you could argue that even beyond that, more transparency is going to be a good thing for us in a world where you can't keep secrets nearly as well as you used to. There is some advantage in bringing bad behavior out into the light. And so I think all those things mean, one, we probably should serve them a bit better. Now they should also participate a bit better. So let's not be confused with this as a two-way street. And two, in general, I think more transparency is going to turn out to be good.
So let me next go to Andrew Hurdle, but I'm just imagining that somewhere in the DNI's office, a head exploded when you said, I think we should share with them our good stuff. So someone's head is exploding in the community management space.
Well, but I did say that I do think there's the need to develop some craft around that.
Okay, yeah.
And what I was thinking, Peter, just so you don't think that I'm just lost my mind, is in the world of cyber, I think we are as good as we are, in fact, because for the past decade, the intelligence community and the private sector have been trying to share data back and forth on cyber threats. But the strength of intelligence is not knowing every IP address of an attack thing to tell some company that incoming in 5 minutes is an attack. There are good things happening on that front with a lot of watchdogs out there. But one of the things that would really help companies is understanding the intent of the adversary. So when they looked at their business, they could say, okay, I understand then what is high value about what I do, and I need to disproportionately protect that. And so without that intention will be hard. And to me, intention is always the good stuff we have. It isn't always the granular stuff. In other words, sometimes it's the stuff we hold most dear. But yeah, I'm sure that there will be a lot of heads popping in the DNI.
Shalom has returned somewhat to Liberty Crossing. Okay, Andrew Hurdle, you're up next. Can you turn on your mic and ask your question?
I think my mic is on.
Okay, go ahead.
Hey, we've got proof of that. That's good. We don't need an intelligence officer to confirm that, but
you had
we had. All right, awesome. So, Director Gordon, appreciate your time tonight and talking about really kind of the law of armed conflict here and such. Warfare is now a completely different animal than it was, right? With tangible effects as a result of cyber operations, and it's no longer one armed force against another. And the oaths you talked about to be ethical in our conduct and support the Constitution. All that stuff. I've taken that oath before, just like you have. And so I ask, how do you think we need to update the laws of armed conflict and our mandate to conduct warfare in an ethical way? I mean, we've got the geeks in one room creating tangible effects in the real environment. So how does our government, all elements of our government in the dime, using the dime, update the laws of armed conflict? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question, damn it. And it's so thoughtful. And I'm not sure I'm going to do the question justice, but when does that stop me from giving it a run? I think one of the things I have considered is that the outcome rather than the method. What is the effect? What happens? In other words, during the laws of armed conflict, we understood how things happened, and certain activities, because we understand how they happen, we knew how to preclude certain activities. I think that is harder for us to do right now because the activities that lead to bad effect don't look the same as they did before. So I think doubling down on deciding what effects, what outcomes are untenable, and then regardless of the modality, you find a way to deter those. My really, really, really weak example that I can come up with on that is actually ransomware. And that is, we worry so much about specific attribution, but we usually can have geographic attribution. So is one of the ways we say and hold people accountable, listen, if it comes from your landmass, from your geography, you're responsible. In other words, I'm not going to try and determine whether it's a rogue element or someone using your infrastructure. We're going to say that if it happens in your geography, you're going to be responsible. And so that drives a different sort of responsibility for those actions. So that's kind of where my head is, but I think this is a really great question. I don't know where CSIS is right now. I think this is a really good thing to explore. There was a comment, I don't know if I said this, Peter, when we were on air or off air, President Biden was at the DNI earlier this week, and one of the things he commented was, I think I mentioned to you all, that if a shooting war happens, it will be a cyber precursor, and that might be true. I think it's a pretty significant statement. But what it prompts me to think about is how unprepared we are to get from a cyber event to the decision to conduct physical attack. And so that's a little bit of a twist on your question, Andrew. I think this is really the stuff we have to work on, is we've been focused so much on the capability, but the use of capability is so different now that we're almost flummoxed by where the lines are. And that's what we need to address. That was a really horrible answer. Tomorrow, I'm going to think of a great one, and I'm going to be angry that I wasn't better for your question. But
Well, let me cluster two questions that came to me via the chat. There are two variants of the same question. One from Francis de Bexedon, and who asks, do liberal communities have fundamental structural disadvantages compared to authoritarian states in terms of cyber war and other, discrete cyber activity? And if so, how can the free world adapt to being behind? And then Stuart Kaplan gives a concrete example of this and asks you to comment on that, which is, how can the US defend itself against social media disinformation originating from adversarial countries without looking like defensive measures appear to favor one side or another in the US political landscape? So those are really two probing on that theme that you and I were talking about. So take a crack at those.
So I think this disinformation thing, I think trust and truth are the two most fundamental attributes of free and open society. And what's so awful about what's happening in the cyberspace now is, and the actors going against the United States, is they're actually eroding truth, right? Eroding belief. And that is really much more devastating to free and open societies than it is to totalitarian regimes. So we have to get a handle on disinformation. And it is a multi-dimensional issue. There's some technical issues. There are ways that people are looking at lies and truth spread differently. There's different metadata around it. So there are some things you can do. But Peter, you mentioned our political environment is so fraught right now that there are people who would take this disinformation, this need to overcome malinformation, and they would turn it into a discussion of content and good speech versus bad speech, which has nothing to do with true speech and false speech, but they are pretty intertwined. And that is a really difficult conversation to have in this environment where Simone Biles' decision has been used politically as though it's evidence of what's happening in America. So I think trust and truth important, have got to solve the malinformation so that we do a better job of having the regular citizen being able to know. It is devastating to our society, and we have to overcome. So that one, it's hard, but there are people really working hard on it. But politics make it difficult. On the other piece, how can America win? Okay, so long haul strategically, we win. Open, competitive environment that Western liberal democracies allow is by far the winning system. It is. The problem is, in times of change or difficulty, those systems look more chaotic in decision making than totalitarian regimes that look, we can do more, we can be more focused, we can better control bad things from happening. It's so attractive in chaotic times, and this is a disrupted time, that I think the most important thing for the United States to do is to not succumb to escalating government authority, to not succumb to making ourselves more closed than open. Hold on one sec, you guys. To not, there are just so many pressures on us to make us be more focused, more different. Tell people they can't come into the country. Tell people they can't do business with them. And I think tactically that feels like something we need to do. long-term that erodes our great strength. So I believe if we can somehow manage to deal with reestablishing trust, it will serve us well to not become the closed societies that everyone else is.
Okay, great question here from John Kirch, which asks you to leave behind your intelligence and become a policymaker in the city.
Okay.
What strategy would you recommend for government and enterprise to minimize ransomware attacks? So do we stop paying the ransom? Do we pay them and steal their Bitcoin? What do we do? How do we, what's a strategy that will reduce this?
Okay, first things first is plan for it. I would tell every company, every boardroom, plan for it, know what you're going to do, have your data in safe places, have a backup plan so that it's not there, and know what you're going to do, know how quickly. Don't ignore the government. We've got some really good examples going on where the government is now actually able to help you. So that would be my first. I think that is okay for rich, big entities. I think small companies that are a little bit more disadvantaged, we need to do something with our national infrastructure to get them in with better foundational capabilities. To the question of paying or not. So I don't want to be righteous about this because I put it in an entirely different venue. If my child is stolen, and I know everyone would say is never pay the ransom, I feel like, am I going to get my kid back? You know, we don't know what's at stake for all these companies. And given that the US governmental structure has not become perfect at being able to recover it, I think that's a difficult question to be absolute. But I will tell you, if you pay, two things are true. There's no guarantee that you're going to get the keys. And once they are in your system, you will never know whether they're really gone. Right? So just know that if you decide to pay, you cannot be assured that you have solved the long-term problem.
Oy. I take it though that you kind of like the idea of us going after the money, or somebody going after the money and reclaiming it. Okay, here's a question from Jason Manley, which is a question I wanted to ask. Your thoughts on Cuba? And it seems like, you know, every other August or so, we get the sense of maybe this is the time that the regime will collapse. I can remember vividly in August 2006, there was, you know, this thought as well. So Cuba, how serious a challenge is the instability that we're seeing there?
I think anything that happens in our hemisphere is a challenge, and a serious one that needs to be addressed. I am not one that believes, how is Venezuela leadership still there? Even Iran, you know, we basically sanctioned them within an inch of their lives, and they're still there. So this notion that these regimes are going to collapse, I don't know what they're going to be replaced with. So I think you have to think that they're still going to be there because that system has worked. I think what is going on in our hemisphere with the unrest, with the activity, is problematic for us because it will tend to spill over. So I think it demands attention. Do I think it's a strategic threat that rises to some of the others? No. And do I believe that leaving it alone is enough? No. So both.
Okay, we're going to close with just two more questions, and I couldn't be happier that the next question is going to be from an incoming first-year student. So she is getting a jump on her Duke AGS experience. This is probably the first earliest. Caitlin Mayer, you turn on your video and your mic and pose your question to Director Gordon, please. Welcome to Duke, by the way. Welcome to Duke.
You're muted, Caitlin.
You're muted. There you go.
Oh, hi, sorry, it wasn't letting me unmute for a second. Thank you so much. So I actually was right before this conversation, I read your 2020 NPR interview, which was really fascinating, by the way. But one of the things you mentioned is the disparity in different presidents' responses to intelligence updates, and especially with regard to rivals like Russia and China, and even like places like Iran that we kind of discussed today. Obviously, the new administration brings a different response than the former, like some would argue tougher on China and nicer on Russia. So my question is, how, if at all, has the intelligence community's paradigm changed due to the foreign policy of the Biden administration? And how do you envision US adversaries responding in the near future?
Oh, what a great question. So I'm gonna shill for a book of Dookie, David Priest, who wrote a book on the Book of Secrets and is really looking at a series of presidents in the PDB that is a really good look at just kind of the arc of all those presidents. So it's just a fun book. If you haven't read it, it's an easy read, and it'll just give it. If I just compare and contrast former President Trump and President Biden, the biggest difference is that former President Trump came into office with two things that were very different from President Biden and, quite frankly, any of his predecessors. And that is absolutely no foundation with which to understand the intelligence community and what it was. And on top of that, it's a more open world. So there are a lot of competitors to intelligence provided by the intelligence community, differences that to him just didn't make any sense. So number one is he doesn't come in expecting to revere intelligence as something special. And even when he does and he gets it, it doesn't seem as special to him as it might, because it's a little less gritty than some of the opinions that are out there because they're not constrained. So I think that's one, right? He's a guy that has no foundation to know what to expect. The second is he's an economic guy and he thinks about leverage, right? He thinks everything is situational and it's a leverage game. And it was hard, I think, a bit for us to catch up to. He didn't just take as a given some of the things that the intelligence community held true about geopolitics, about our partners, about second and third order effects. I mean, those just, we take them as a given, and former President Trump was like, prove it. And we're like, what? You know, and that was just a hard thing for us to do. President Biden comes in and he is of us. I mean, he has served before as the vice president. He's been in Congress. He's received briefings. He is of us. He is trying to calm a world that had a hard time figuring out this disruptor that was Donald Trump, right? So part of what he's trying to do is to calm a world. What I would offer you to think about, and for everyone to think about, is it's not just that former President Trump was a disruptor. It is a disrupted time. The world is different, and there are different forces acting on it, different than when President Biden was vice president, different in the person. And so what I think the Biden administration's challenge is to, while it wants to calm the world, to not miss all the differences that demand action. And I think that will be the most interesting thing. And the question will be, is the intelligence community relieved that now they have someone who gets them? Or they continue to understand, oh my gosh, we've got to produce intelligence that is supportive of this disrupted time. So I think it's a really great question you asked, and you're going to watch it unfold. You are.
Okay, and last question goes to Grace Garverick, who is going to turn on her mic and her video. And Grace, you get to pose the last question.
Okay, perfect. It won't let me start my video for some reason because it said.
Yeah, but just hearing your voice, Grace, I can imagine you.
All right, perfect. Well, again, Dr. Gordon, thank you for, talking to us. My question, I think, is, as globalization and connectivity increase, how will the intelligence community have to adjust to how it gathers information? You know, specifically, I'm thinking about how much information is out there with open source intelligence now. And then how do you possibly begin to even sift through all that open source intelligence with the resources we have?
Yeah, so here's what I think the exercise I would do if I were still in the intelligence community is, you know, you can't get to the future from the present. You just can't do it because you're dragging too much along. So I would say, imagine if the intelligence community were being started in 2021 with a world that has all this capability, not 1947. Same mission, you know, you're still working to provide advantage. You want to know a little bit more. You want to have a more certainty. You want to be able to see more things going on. Same mission, but you have a really different world. If you plop the intelligence community into this world today without all that, you would use open information. You would use all the commercial information that is being produced. I'm not talking just social media. I'm talking about data sets that the commercial sector is making available to you. You would absolutely, but you would still have the obligation to have some craft around that. So my view is the intelligence community has to use open information, unhidden information better, but they have to develop a tradecraft and a system around it, because it's not just an analyst sitting letting the world come into them. It's how do you consider it with all the other things? But you will have to do it, and you will have to use machines to augment it. And if you can imagine that, you will start moving to it. And I think that our foreign partners all see the same thing. The technology we require to be able to do that is a global technology. And so the solution to this issue of using open information is actually something that the community could use to build global partnerships with allies and partners. It's a really good question, Grace, and it's good to see you.
Well, it just remains for me to do a bit of advertising for what's coming. If this whetted your appetite for more about spycraft, then I encourage you to come on August 11th at 7 p.m. for a book discussion about an aspect of spycraft we really haven't talked about, counterintelligence. We're going to be discussing Ben McIntyre's classic book, A Spy Among Friends, about Kim Philby, one of the great Russian intelligence successes, one of the great intelligence failures on our side. That'll be a fun way to finish the summer. And then on August 23rd, fun way to launch the new year with our ice cream social. But I think you can see why I feel a twinge of guilt in taking Sue Gordon away from federal government, where she has served so well, and sort of hoarding her as a precious Duke resource. And I can only live with this guilt, with the knowledge that she's producing not 1970s strong Sue Gordons, but she's producing 20s and 30s strong Sue Gordons of the future to restock and replenish our nation's public servants. Okay. And so for that, I thank you. I thank you for your service in the past and for what you're doing now, Sue. And I especially thank you for what you did today. Thank you. We're very much in your debt.
Great to be with you all. Thanks, Peter.
And with that, I will say goodbye.